there is a big story that has been taking over the airwaves in many respects over the past few days. The media has been very attentive to the removal of Captain Brett Crozier from the U.S.S. Theodore Roosevelt. Now, the U.S.S. Theodore Roosevelt is a ship with a crew of about 5,000 sailors. And it has weaponry on there, nuclear material. It is a very sensitive and important ship. So with the spread of this coronavirus on there, over 100 have tested positive on board. The captain, Brett Crozier, was very concerned about his crew and sent a letter on which he copied 20 to 30 other individuals on that notification. And it ended up being leaked out to the press. I want to play a clip here to help set the stage a little bit. This is cut 4, Navy Secretary Thomas Modly speaking on the fired captain and what happened.
Today, at my direction, the commanding officer of the U.S.S. Theodore Roosevelt, Captain Brett Crozier, was relieved of command by Carrier Strike Group Commander Rear Admiral Stuart Baker. The executive officer, Captain Dan Keeler, has assumed command temporarily until such time as Rear Admiral Select Carlos Sardiello arrives in Guam to assume command. We all understand and cherish our responsibilities and, frankly, our love for all of our people in uniform. But to allow those emotions to color our judgment when communicating the current operational picture can, at best, create unnecessary confusion and, at worst, provide an incomplete picture of American combat readiness to our adversaries. When the commanding officer of the U.S.S. Teddy Roosevelt decided to write his letter on the 30th of March, 2020, that outlined his concerns for his crew in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak, the Department of the Navy had already mobilized significant resources for days in response to his previous requests. On the same day marked on his letter, my chief of staff called the CO directly at my direction to ensure he had all the resources necessary for the health and safety of his crew. Worse, the captain's actions made his sailors, their families, and many in the public believe that his letter was the only reason help from our larger Navy family was forthcoming, which was hardly the case. I could reach no other conclusion that Captain Crozier had allowed the complexity of his challenge with the COVID breakout on the ship to overwhelm his ability to act professionally, when acting professionally was what was needed most at the time. We do, and we should, expect more from the commanding officer of our aircraft carriers.
That's the argument from Navy Secretary Thomas Modly for why Captain Crozier was removed from command, relieved of command. So when I said fired before, that's what I meant, was removed from his post as captain of the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Was that compelling? Was that appropriate on the part of the Navy Secretary and those underneath his command to make this decision to remove the captain? Or was the captain just doing his level best to provide his people with notice, with a heads up that something was wrong with his crew and with the coronavirus spread? Let's talk about it with Major General Paul Vallely, U.S. Army retired, who's also chairman of Stand Up America U.S. Foundation and has been a military analyst on the Fox News channel. General Vallely joins us now. Sir, welcome to Jimmy at the Crossroads. So great to have you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Happy to be with you.
So, sir, let me just ask you right up front. Do you think the Navy was within its rights to make this decision, and was it the right decision to make, especially at this point in time?
Well, it's a great question, and it deals with a number of issues here, which I'll be happy to explain to you. The carrier had docked previously off of Da Nang, Vietnam, and that's probably where they picked up and got infected, the crew members, some, I guess, 300. So at that time, the aircraft carrier went back into the South China Sea. Now, here's what has to be done. The Navy Secretary didn't like the way he handled it. Certainly down through the chain of command, 4 levels down almost from the Secretary of the Navy, would be the captain of that aircraft carrier working for a fleet admiral. And so the fleet admiral had to make the call, not the Secretary of the Navy on that. But here's the thing. When you look at readiness and you look at what signals you may be sending to our adversaries, you must keep any vulnerability of our force or of the members of that sailors on that aircraft carrier. The protocol is you have to keep that in the chain of command, and you don't make a mistake by writing a letter that is messaged out to a number of different recipients. So he did make a mistake. He's well respected. He should be put back, in command somewhere along the line and not have his career ruined because of this. He's served too many years and he's a good combat warrior, and that's what we need. So hopefully this will just be a slap on the hands, and they're going to give him a good position and reinstate him again. That's what I would recommend.
So in other words, penalize him for the time being for what he did in terms of allowing this letter to be leaked. I mean, we don't know that he allowed it to be leaked, but the question is, how in the world could it have happened, and why did he CC so many people?
Yeah, that's exactly, and that's a mistake. Commanders make a mistake continually, but in the military, with discipline and protocol, I've forgiven a lot of my commanders, even in combat in Vietnam, who made some mistakes that I thought at the time. But certainly, I counseled them, and I didn't get them fired or relieved of command at that point in time for messaging, for example, and communications. But we can't give away any vulnerabilities to our fleet forces and to our armed forces to the Chinese or the Russians or whoever. So it was a mistake made, but it should be rectified. And he needs to be reinstated, in my opinion, Jimmy.
And that, to me, Major General Paul Vallely, U.S. Army retired, is the crux of the matter. I asked a friend of mine who's been on this program. He's a former military intelligence contractor for about 15 years, including the last decade of the Cold War, Keith Nobles. And he said this, I wanted to share with you and get your reaction. How sick the military may or may not be must be highly classified information available on a need-to-know basis only. Sharing that information with those who did not need to know is unacceptable. And that's where the media, I think, is missing this. They're trying to say that this captain was removed from duty because relieved of his position because he was warning the administration, in essence, about this, and the Trump administration, Navy Secretary on up, wanted to hide it. But this seems to me to be what's really going on, is China and Russia were able to get news of what's happening with a very important carrier.
That's right, vulnerability, how it affects force readiness and the perception of our enemies, like China, for example. So it was a mistake made, and the media blows up a lot of different things, the fake news. They try to blame Trump, and this guy's this and that. We know he's a good commander. We know he's well educated. He's a trained warrior. And so the mistake was made, and at some point he needs to be forgiven here by the chain of command and the admirals that he works for.
Major General Vallely, let's look at this cut 6. This is his crew. His crew very enthusiastic and cheering for the captain as he was leaving his post there after having been removed by the Navy. They're shouting, Captain Crozier. What does that tell you, especially because the media is putting this up as an example of how the crew idolized it, which is understandable. It was their captain, and he's at a minimum, he was trying to let people know about his concerns. It's how he did it that seems to be particularly problematic. But what do you make of that, especially as someone who has commanded many men in our uniform?
Well, number one, you can tell he was very well respected by the crew members. So that means he's a good commander when you have that kind of respect. And so from that standpoint, they were basically messaging out that we respect this man, we respect him as a commander. They probably realized maybe he made a mistake, but they're not going to say that. But it still goes back to the main issue, Jimmy, that he made a mistake, and this could be rectified. We didn't have anybody killed because of it. but on the other hand, it showed some vulnerability of that particular aircraft carrier. And so that's the core of the issue.
General Vallely, let's shift gears because I'm curious your thoughts overall on the national security implications of the spread of this virus. Obviously, policymakers are doing everything they can to flatten the curve and slow the spread. We're now in the midst of what they're calling 30 days to slow the spread, and this could be the worst week that America will face as far as deaths as a result of this horrible, horrible pandemic. What do you make of it, in particular, the concern now for America? I mean, we're being told by military officials that America's readiness is not at top notch, which of course we need. And maybe, just maybe, China, Russia, they could take advantage of what's going on here, even though they have been dealing with their own health issues in their own country.
Well, our readiness is at a new high level due to the money and support that President Trump has given to the Department of Defense after it was totally, I would say, decreased under the Obama administration. Terrible what happened to our Defense Department and our readiness. Now the morale is up. We have the fleets out there. As you may have noticed, we charged up the Atlantic Fleet to send some of our ships down off Mexico because the increase of cartel activity south of our border. We've also increased the fleet forces that went through the Sea of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf to offset an Iranian threat. We still have the Chinese threat. So there's a balance that the commanders are doing right now to make sure we have our readiness. We're ready to neutralize or take out any threat to the United States or its citizens. At the same time, trying to manage the virus within the forces right now. And everyone should know we have great medical people in the armed forces. We have great hospitals, great doctors, great nurses. And so those soldiers and sailors are going to be well taken care of until we can get past this infectious disease.
Major General Paul Vallely, U.S. Army retired, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Again, appreciate your time. I want to ask you about the Defense Production Act. I'm deeply concerned about the implementation of this in this case. I understand that the U.S. military has carried out many logistical operations for military defense purposes, but I don't feel comfortable, I have to say, as a free market person with the government taking the initiative in this way and in many regards nationalizing important supply chains, not just saying, go ahead and manufacture these masks, for example, N95 masks or ventilators, although I do have some issues when companies are already stepping up of their own accord of having the federal government make those demands. But okay, that's one thing. But when I see an admiral get up there and say, of course, under orders from the President of the United States, but talking about how they're micromanaging supply chains, that makes me feel uncomfortable. As somebody who doesn't like the government controlling things in our lives, what do you make of the Defense Production Act and its usage right now by the President?
First of all, that act is set forth because of crises and threats to our national security. And the corporations involved in the supply chain operations don't necessarily have the intelligence that our president does or our Defense Department admirals and generals have. And so our logistics, supply logistics in the military is so effective and so well thought out, computerized. All of that is in there. The American military are always called upon, earthquakes, whatever happens, tsunamis, because they can react quicker than anybody can, quicker than corporations can, because we can alert the forces and then we can deploy those forces to neutralize whatever that threat or assist in a crisis such as an earthquake or a tsunami that we've seen in the past. And so that Defense Act will not be overused by the Trump administration. But if there is a supply chain operation that's not effective or a corporation's not following that, like 3M Company, then the president's authorized to direct them to do certain things under this act. And I think it's right to do, but certainly we don't want anything federalized. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is having these corporations understand what's going on and then prioritize the flow in that supply chain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I follow along. My concern comes with the idea that, look, I mean, I have tremendous respect for the military, which is why it's difficult to make this particular criticism for me. But to say that in a crisis situation, we can have the government will be able to know how to go about this. But in our daily, day-to-day
Right.
lives as Americans in the economy, the government doesn't know how to do it. I just find a contradiction as an American who looks at the socialist countries that have failed against the United States over history in the last 100 years to then think that, well, this is an example where in a crisis situation, the government's really good at handling these supply chains. But day to day, I find it hard to make that argument. And then on the other hand, say day to day, we shouldn't have the government in charge of our economy.
Well, when you talk about the government, you're talking about Homeland Security, you're talking about Treasury, you're talking about all these different administrations within a government. But separate that out from the military, because that's completely different from the other organizations within our government. As we've seen them, defeat the two superpowers in World War II, the Nazis and the Japanese. You can see that we can be on alert and we can take on that particular threat immediately. We can hit any target 24 hours a day anywhere in the world. That's how sophisticated we are and how great our technology is. So you can't just bunch DOD in with all the other bureaucratic deep state organizations. It's just a different
I
way
see what you're
you have to
saying.
look at it.
Sure, fair
Yeah.
enough. Major General Paul Vallely, U.S. Army retired. We just got another minute or two with you, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell us a little bit about your organization, Stand Up America U.S. Foundation. I would welcome the opportunity to hear about it, share it with our viewers.
Well, thank you. Well, we've been in existence since 2005. It is the Stand Up America U.S. Foundation, not just Stand Up America. In 2015, George Soros funded a group called Stand Up America to counter me. And so we have to make sure when you Google it, it's Stand Up America U.S. Foundation. Our website is standupamericaus.org, standupamericaus.org. We also put out a newsletter every 2 weeks, but go to our website. We've been posting a lot of good material on that in the last 2 days. So we need your support continually to the foundation. Any way you can help us spread the word, donate, we'll appreciate that. Well, that'll keep us alive and well.
General Vallely, such a pleasure and a treat to have you on the show. I hope you will come back, and I appreciate your insights today. Thank you.
Absolutely, Jimmy. Be happy to.
Again, Major General Paul Vallely, U.S. Army retired, joining us here on the show. Great conversation. And also chairman of Stand Up America U.S. Foundation. Be sure to check them out. We're going to take